Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. My name's Andrew Sumner, and I'm privileged to be joined by an old friend of Forbidden Planet, Mr. Neil Gaiman, and very privileged to be joined by the mighty Chris Riddell, author, illustrator, political cartoonist for The Observer. Good morning, Chris. How are you?
Good morning. I'm very well. What I'm going to be doing is going backwards and forwards. So you'll see my corporeal presence. And then every so often, I can go back and become a disembodied hand, drawing things. Usually while Neil is saying something really interesting, I'll attempt to upstage him through the by drawing something inappropriate.
Fantastic. And we're all here to talk about Chris's illustrated version of Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which has just been published by Macmillan and is available from Forbidden Planet from the links attached to this conversation.
I've brought along my copy here, and this is a very special copy. I brought it down so that we could talk about it. And on the cover, you can see Marvin with his cup of tea. And I had this on my coffee table the other day. I brought it down specially to show. And then a good friend of mine spilt his cup of tea on my copy. So this is a pre-stained copy with tea of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Supremely interactive copy of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
It is quite surreal for me. This is the first time I've seen Chris's book because I'm in New Zealand. And it's quite surreal for me to see a copy of that book, of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, with my name on the cover and saying something about it, which is partly strange just because I'm sure I said those words, because at this point in my life I must have written something in the region of 150,000 words about Douglas and Hitchhikers. So going and finding that wouldn't be very hard. If one could go back in time and tell 22-year-old Neil Gaiman, who has just interviewed his hero, Douglas Adams, for the first time, for, if memory serves, Penthouse, that one day, 38 years from now, a copy of Hitchhikers will be out and his name will be on the front recommending it. I think you would have broken his brain. I actually think, baby Neil would not have understood that world. And I'm not entirely sure that 60-year-old Neil understands that world.
And for our sort of millennial viewers, Penthouse obviously was a property magazine from the 1970s. So promoting flat shares and good investment opportunities in Hoxton, that sort of thing.
Absolutely, that vital stuff. And of course, Neil, as you just mentioned, you went way back with Douglas Adams, way back with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. In fact, anybody watching this on Forbidden Planet TV on YouTube, you can flip back to a previous edition, which is audio of Neil actually interviewing Douglas Adams at Forbidden Planet in the early 90s. We rescued that audio for our 42nd celebration last year, and it's up there now for everybody to check out. I'll include the links attached to the links to buy the book.
It's so funny. My history with Douglas goes back all the way, all the way to the very, very beginning of my career. And I weirdly, thinking about blurbs, it's technically not the first time that I've written a blurb on a Douglas Adams book, because when Don't Panic came out, which was the book that I wrote in, I think, 86, published in, I think, 87, about Douglas Adams and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We asked Douglas for a blurb, and he just said, well, Neil, just write a bunch of blurbs and I'll use the ones I like. So I sat and wrote 8 or 9 blurbs in the style of Douglas Adams and sent them over to Douglas, who picked "It's all absolutely true except the bits that are lies" and the best book to be written about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy since this morning, I think, as the 2 blurbs that he liked best. So Douglas Adams blurbed the book to that effect in the UK and the US.
In the spirit of sort of, blurbs, there must be in the Douglas Adams universe a planet blurb that actually, possibly is arid and sort of windswept and sort of possibly a very hostile and difficult planet to live on, but has spectacular TripAdvisor reviews. It's fantastic, place to go.
Yes, these little creatures who just come up to you and say, "Pulse pounding, exciting, I couldn't put it down."
Oh, unputdownable, yes.
Yes, the little blurbs. A blurb term here, I will do trivia because it's late at night here in New Zealand, and once it gets late at night, the trivia creatures come out in my brain. The word blurb was invented by an American named Gelett Burgess, an American humorist, most famous probably for having written a poem about a purple cow, which went something like, "I've never seen a purple cow. I never wish to see one, but I can tell you anyhow, I'd rather see them be one." And he coined a few terms, and blurb was his invention to describe the effusive praise on a book jacket, which until that point did not have a name. And he also, the other word that he tried to get behind, which didn't really ever fly, was huzzlecoo, which meant to praise something inordinately in order to sort of flatter it or something. The huzzlecoo, and that could be a huzzlecoo, a sort of Scottish huzzle cow, I suppose.
I've never heard that term, and it's fantastic. I really love it.
It is a great term. It didn't, it's weird. Some words work. Blurb worked, and huzzlecoo never did.
I have to say, this is an incredibly tranquil experience. Listening to you talk and watching you draw, Chris, it's like the best episode of Play School ever. Going through the round window. I've watched you do quite a few of these things online, Chris, and I've often wondered what it would like to watch one seeing it live like this. I think one of the things is it's very easy to get so absorbed in what you're doing that you actually forget to ask a question.
It's definitely, speaking as somebody who has now done, by my count, 137 separate events with Chris. This is far and away my favorite way of doing it, because when I'm on a stage with him, I never see what he's drawing. I just hear audiences laugh.
Yeah.
And because you're facing the audience and Chris is drawing away and it's being projected behind you. And sometimes from the enormous, the fact that the laughter just gets really, really loud, he's just drawn you. Because that's the only way that
it can get awkward, can't it, Neil? I do remember at the Hay Festival when you and I and the wonderful Stephen Fry were doing an event, and I was doing my sort of drawing in the background, and you would say something wonderful about sort of Thor outraging a goat or something that I just had to draw. And then the person controlling the giant screen would turn to me drawing Thor outraging a goat. But you'd have moved on and you'd be telling a very, very sort of sensitive story about possibly, a childhood experience, while the audience roared at my rather rude drawing. So it was the sort of trying to get us in cue, which I feel, given the mellowness of the New Zealand late night and the Norfolk early morning. We're having a similar sort of, interaction now. You're very sort of calm and peaceful, and you're thinking of wonderful sort of things. And I'm just reaching for my first cup of coffee.
And of course, you've drawn something faintly owlish at Galactic Play School, as seen
through the round window.
Through the round window, yeah, fantastic.
Or the round porthole, one or the other. I'm now sort of, my mind is being sort of, full of images of sort of Floella Benjamin in Zero Gravity, or Brian Kant with sort of antennae sort of strapped to his head, talking to small hairy creatures from Alpha Centauri.
One of the great things I discovered, which was rather like, in some ways going back in time, and in some ways like discovering there are still the Tyrannosauruses that Chris and I remember from the 1960s still around, is both Australia and New Zealand have play school. In the UK, it may have died out, and Big Ted and Little Ted and Humpty may have all gone the way of all things. But if you come to Australia or to New Zealand, there is New Zealand Play School and Australian Play School, and they're brilliant. They're
How
really
lovely.
good.
Do they have their own? Do they have Big Ted and Little Ted, or is it other
They have
versions?
they obviously have been keeping some of the same toy traditions going for Lord alone knows how many years. But they have all of their own presenters and all of their own sort of homegrown ways of doing play school. Really fun.
Yeah, I'm just transported now. We took now into the sort of Australian play school, where you've got sort of Big Ted, Little Ted. The one I was always fascinated by was this sort of gonk, I think, with the very, very long arms. I'm not sure he did a lot, but he was sort of a round, sort of cuddly creature. And then maybe sort of, I'm just imagining sort of in the Australian play school, sort of Big Ted, Little Ted, and absolutely enormous platypus.
Brilliant. That's lovely. I always really liked Hamble, because Hamble always felt vaguely sinister to me.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? The way that sort of, in our childhood imaginations, sort of things that are meant to be sort of benign and rather sort of wonderful can be the stuff of nightmares. Now, I remember a children's annual, innocent sort of book for the very young, had a terrifying illustration of a clown who, in my imagination, he had black and white sort of, hair almost. But he reminded me of Jimmy Savile.
Yeah.
And so right from the
terrifying.
very youngest, so this was when Jimmy Savile was seen as a benign and rather wonderful figure. I was always terrified of him as a very young child because of this illustration in a children's book. We've gone to a very dark place. We really should come back, shouldn't we, to something rather more.
In an endeavour to pull us towards the light, could you guys talk about the genesis of this project and how it came about, Chris?
Well, I was asked whether, in one of those wonderful sort of moments you get from time to time, I was asked whether by the publishers at Macmillan, whether I knew or liked or had read sort of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I said, of course, because I had listened as a child to a schoolboy, actually, sort of 16 years old. I had listened, like many of my contemporaries, to the radio program, the series Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and completely loved it, just fall in love with it. And I wasn't that familiar with the written version that Douglas sort of wrote later. But so I said yes immediately. I said I would love to illustrate the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy because I just loved the radio show far more, I think, than the TV was fun, but it had that sort of early Doctor Who quality to it, but I really enjoyed and absolutely loved the radio. So I was a little bit worried actually when they sent me the book, because I hadn't read it. And I was a little bit worried that, you know, it was going to be a sort of disappointing memory of sort of the radio show I remember. But as I started reading it, I realized just what a fantastic stylist Douglas Adams was. And what he did so beautifully was he sort of became the wonderful Peter Jones, if that's possible. You know, the wonderful voice that led you through this world and stopped and every so often and said, you know, gave you a preface or he would just sort of, you know, Douglas captured that voice in his prose in the book, and I fell in love with the book. Because it transported me back to my 16-year-old self listening to a crackly sort of radio, you know, in my bedroom, just loving the images. And I had a problem. I thought, well, how on earth do I bring my experience of this wonderful work as an illustrator? How do I illustrate this? And I decided very early on that what I would do is I would sort of do the a little sort of illustrations of the principal characters, almost as a cast list, and then leave it at that. And what I attempted to do was illustrate the voice of the book, Douglas's voice, the narrator, and that became a complete joy because one could sort of illustrate some of the wonderful sort of asides within the book. So here is Oolon Colafid, who is the author of 50 More Things to Do in Zero Gravity, and more controversially, Oolon Colafid's trilogy of philosophical blockbusters, Where God Went Wrong, Some More of God's Greatest Mistakes, and Who Is This God Person Anyway? It was wonderful. And then before chatting with Neil, I did a little event with Richard Dawkins. And I couldn't resist drawing Richard Dawkins as Oolin Colafid, because I feel if there's any figure who would rival Oolon, it would be Richard. I'm not sure how he took that. It's sort of, you know, it was an interesting event. And so throughout the book, what I've attempted to do, this is another one of my absolute favorites. This is Flarty Bartfast. You know, that, boy, I love that name. That just a name to conjure with. Inventor and designer of the fjords of Norway. But it was sort of that feel that I wanted to get across, rather than go through and sort of try and illustrate the actual events unfolding. I just wanted to illustrate the voice of the book, the wonderful, wonderful voice of the book. And there is a little thing on a promotion that's sort of for Hitchhikers, where people were invited to quote their favorite bits from Hitchhikers. And I just saw a tweet where someone had quoted this wonderful sort of thing that it's the bowl of petunias falling towards the planet, and the quote was, you know, "Oh no, not again." That is sort of Adam's genius, isn't it? To sort of, you know, conjure up a whole other narrative from a single line. And I've got to say, it's something that a very young and sort of ingenue who worked for a property magazine back in the 70s was influenced by. A very young Neil Gaiman, I think, must have sort of, you know, imbibed some of this genius in his work, because Neil, you do something very similar. You have the ability to conjure up a whole backstory or a whole future story just in a throwaway phrase, you know, something just, you know, you would pass over normally. The Queen kissed Sleeping Beauty because, you know, someone had to, and suddenly we're in a whole new place. Wonderful. What I would love to know is Neil, your sort of memories of Douglas, having had the sort of pleasure of illustrating this wonderful book. I really miss not having met him. Tell me a little bit about Douglas.
Douglas was very tall and rather awkward. It was the awkwardness of somebody who wasn't quite looking where he was going. He was, 6'5", but seemed like he was all knees and elbows. And once complained to me, and it wasn't quite a complaint, but it was a very Douglas sort of complaint, that he had to be terribly rich because he was incredibly rubbish at money. And it seemed to take him an awful lot more money to do things than it did other people. Because, and he gave as an example of this, finding some giant crayons in California and deciding that they and only they would be the perfect decoration for his place in Islington, and buying them and then shipping them at enormous expense to Islington, and coming back to Islington and discovering that the place, a little sort of fashion shop next door, also sold them. And Douglas would tell these stories, and they would be funny and heartbreaking, and also kind of, and they were also true. Douglas, at the point where he figured he had enough money to not have to write novels anymore, because he didn't enjoy writing novels. He loved making things up. But at the point where he really was in that sort of 30-something-year-old able to retire, that was the point where he discovered that his accountant had embezzled all of the money, spent all of the money, and then, to add insult to injury, committed suicide, which Douglas was never able to quite muster the sympathy for, but perhaps he should have been. And he would just sort of, he went back and he wrote books again, which I think was good for everybody, except possibly Douglas and his dead accountant. Douglas, I'm trying to think of little anecdotes that sum Douglas up. Douglas was somebody who once told me that in trying to figure out who could be the voice of the book, they spent several days in casting talking about who could do the sort of Peter Jones voice that Douglas had in his head. And finally, Simon Brett actually suggested to him that possibly Peter Jones might be a good idea. I'm trying to think of some of my favorite memories of Douglas. My favorite memories were after I interviewed him a few times, and we had that sort of, an interviewer, famous author relationship at that point. It got to the point where he knew my face because I'd interviewed him, I think, 3 times. But then I got hired to do Don't Panic, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy Companion. And at that point, we had to sort of become friends because I was sitting in his office, in his home office all day, going through his filing cabinets. And these were filing cabinets that he had not looked in. And I was sitting there going through draft after draft of the radio show, draft after draft of the TV scripts, draft after draft of anything I could find, just looking for fabulous lines, great jokes, good ideas that have been cut out at some stage, and that I could seize and drop into the book so it would have original lines and original gags in. And I think Douglas got very used to me, and at some point was very surprised when I actually somewhere in his archives found the Doctor Who and the Cricket Men outline, which had been the pitch for a Doctor Who movie, which had been, I think, looking back on it, incredibly wisely rejected, and which then was basically, and Douglas got to recycle all of the good bits for the novel Life, the Universe, and Anything anyway. So I got to sort of look at this strange and wonderful outline, you know, with the benefit of hindsight.
I have to stop you there, Neil, and just ask you, you know, Doctor Who and the Cricket Men. I'm imagining a sort of cyber cricket team that is just, you know, flouting the sort of the laws of cricket. Possibly they would have Australian accents. I'm not sure.
And exploding cricket balls. Yes.
Oh, really?
The idea was that everywhere else in the galaxy, cricket is regarded as this awful, terrifying, dreadful thing, and a legacy of the cricket men, spelled Krikkit, I think. And only on Earth would we be so incredibly weird as to actually reenact the monstrousness of this absolute nightmare.
An episode I wish I had seen, I've got to say, but not necessarily for the right reasons.
It was never actually shot. And one day, I'm sure somebody will, in this world that we're in today, readapt the existing books, and everything will wind up on telly, because telly right now eats every single thing there is, and spits it out again.
Yeah,
so
it feels like kind of a James Goss project to me, to be honest. Hearing you talk about it, that's exactly the kind of thing he specializes in.
It was so interesting. Douglas had such bitterness and a certain amount of sadness about the BBC version. And yet he also wound up, I think, loving it and stealing a lot of good things from it back into the books. You know, Arthur Dent isn't wearing a dressing gown through the first two books. The dressing gown was invented as part of the TV series. Douglas had a scene where Arthur gets he starts out in his dressing gown and then gets a sort of a Lost in Space silver space suit. And the director and producer said, no, we've seen those before, but we haven't seen anybody in a dressing gown. So I just kept him in the dressing gown, and the dressing gown, more than anything, I think became utterly archetypal. And by the time Douglas got to his third book, Arthur's in his dressing gown.
It's wonderful, isn't it, when that sort of happens? Because I think the idea of the radio show, I think, was for all of us who sort of began our journey with on radio. No other iteration quite captured it in that way, and I think coming to the book, I love the way in which the book actually successfully recreates that feel that one gets, and maybe that is sort of the magic of both, you know, a medium like radio, but also the sort of medium of the book. And it feels right, in a sense, that a book about a book is now, you know, a book. In a way that I'm not sure a Netflix series will ever quite sort of do Douglas Adams justice.
You know, Douglas used to talk about the fact that the pictures in your head were better. For me, the line that I would always point to as something that could only work on radio was Ford, you're turning into an infinite number of penguins.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Because any attempt to capture that in any visual medium, even the magic of Chris's pen, and I have seen Chris draw, I've written things that are impossible to draw and watch Chris draw them with ease, panache, and aplomb. But you sort of go, no, an infinite number of penguins in your head is always going to be more visual than any visual representation of it, which can only imply.
That is very true. And I've got to say, my favorite sort of part, again, was something that as a child, sort of as a schoolboy listening to the radio, just threw up a wonderful, wonderful image. And it's this, and if I may, I'd love to sort of read this little sort of passage, because it's my absolute sort of favorite. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a very unevenly edited book and contains many passages that simply seemed to his editors like a good idea at the time. One of them supposedly relates the experiences of one Vít Vujicic, a quiet young student at the University of Maximegalon, who pursued a brilliant academic career studying ancient philology, transformational ethics, and the wave harmonic theory of historical perception. And then, after a night of drinking pan-galactic gargle juice with Zaphod Beetleprox, became increasingly obsessed with the problem of what had happened to all the biros he had bought over the past few years. I followed a long period of painstaking research in which he visited all the major centers of biro loss throughout the galaxy, and eventually came up with a quaint little theory which quite caught the public imagination at the time. Somewhere in the cosmos, he said, along with all the planets inhabited by humanoids, reptiloids, fishoids, walking treeoids, and super intelligent shades of the color blue, there was also a planet entirely given over to biro life forms. And it was to this planet that unattended biros would make their way, slipping away quietly through wormholes in space to a world where they knew they could enjoy a uniquely biroid lifestyle, responding to highly biro-oriented stimuli and generally leading the biro equivalent of the good life. Now, I've got to say, as a lover of biros and pens in all their forms, as are you, Neil, the idea of a biro planet and the biro equivalent of the good life, it's just something I had to illustrate. It's one of those things, less challenging than infinite numbers of penguins, but really sort of rewarding at the same time. And it seems to me, Neil, if you're in search of work, given that you probably are no longer employed by that property magazine from the 1970s, maybe we could sort of come up with some sort of Netflix series. I'm just sort of wondering, it could be sort of set in this biro world.
The Adventures of the Brave Little Biro.
It could be. That could be sort of the beginning of something, certainly.
I love what you've chosen to do, in that everything. Douglas used to talk, I once remember commenting to him about his asides and the amazing cast off lines. And he said, yes, he said, but all of the really good asides and the really good tossed off lines, I have to spend ages building a structure that everybody can climb up and not know that they're climbing up it. So at the end, I can just toss off a line. But what I love is it feels like what you're doing, Chris, instead of attacking the narrative thrust of Hitchhikers, you are going for the asides, you're going for the tossed off lines, you're going for those beautiful little moments and things that Douglas did with words and pictures in your head.
The guide started to explain to anyone who cared to listen about the best ways of smuggling Antaran parakeet glands out of Antares, An Antarean parakeet gland stuck on a small stick is a revolting but much sought after cocktail delicacy, and very large sums of money are often paid for them by very rich idiots who want to impress other very rich idiots. So, you know, Neil, that is an invitation, isn't it, to draw an Antarean parakeet. And of course, its glands. It's one of the great joys, I think, and which brings me to sort of one of my great inspirations, I think, when thinking of alien life forms was this. If I can introduce you to this, this is the Genitals of the Universe, a wonderful New Yorker cartoon by the immortal B. Cliban, a wonderful cartoonist, renowned for cats. But here is his wonderful cartoon, Genitals of the Universe. It is just a wonderful flight of Douglas Adams' fancy, I would say. And so as I was illustrating the wonderful asides in Hitchhikers, there was ample opportunity to draw things that sort of were considered, you know, would in any sort of galactic sense be sort of pornographic, but in the world of the Genitals of the Universe, you know, no editor could stop me. And I used to look forward to various, this is Gag Halfront. He actually has one of the biros that makes an escape and goes off to live in the world of the biro. But it just meant I could just be rude in plain sight, which was one of the great pleasures. This is the Galactic Institute Prize for Extreme Cleverness. I think in the spirit of the sort of Oscars, it would be given another name. So I like to think of this as the clever dick. Now, you know, in any other context, there would be a high-level meeting at the publishers where they'd say, what on earth, there seems to be an erect phallus on page 113. How did this happen? I said, no, it's the clever dick. It's a Galactic Institute Prize for Extreme Cleverness. And one could move on. The only problem I sort of came across through the sort of editorial process was when it came to the wonderful Eccentrica Galambits, the triple-breasted whore of Eroticon 6, which I've got to say, as a 16-year-old, I found both titillating and hilarious when I heard it on the radio. And of course, the triple-breasted nature was wonderful. But then there was one of these meetings that, again, I sort of live for, where I was called in to discuss, you know, some editorial changes they felt they needed to make. And we discussed with great seriousness and literary sort of import, we discussed whether the triple breasts should have visible nipples or not. It was decided for cultural reasons to remove the nipples. Which I've got to say, you know, given sort of Genitals of the Universe, I felt was a valid decision. But also this Eccentrica's sort of hairstyle was actually far ruder than it appears here, and that had to be doctored as well to a certain extent. And again, you know, I'd love to sort of read the minutes of that meeting, possibly, because I think Douglas Adams would have enjoyed writing that. Come in, Mr. Riddell. We've got to discuss the genitalia on Eccentrica Galambit's head. Is that an ear, or is it in fact, yes. So yes, great joy doing it, and none more than
there's a Vogon,
another favorite of mine, which was the Vogon and Vogon poetry. I'm a poetry lover, and I know, Neil, you write and have written some of my favorite poems. It's wonderful, but there is a sort of sense in which, you know, sort of we're easy targets, poet lovers, and no, not least, you know, sort of Vogon Jeltz, who loves to sort of read his poetry to on the tannoy system to the trapped inhabitants of his spaceship, and actually sort of illustrating sort of this Vogon again was a great pleasure, because he is sort of, you know, has evolved in the most sort of appalling way. And I love, again, sort of Douglas's sort of voice here coming across. It just reminds me so much of the radio show. Prostechnik Vogan Jults was not a pleasant sight, even for other Vogons. His highly domed nose rose high above a small piggy forehead. His dark green rubbery skin was thick enough for him to play the game of Vogon civil service politics and play it well, and waterproof enough for him to survive indefinitely at sea depths of up to 1,000 feet with no ill effects. Not that he ever went swimming, of course. His busy schedule would not allow it. He was the way he was because a billion years ago, the Vogons had first crawled out of the sluggish primeval seas of Vogsphere and had lain panting and heaving on the planet's virgin shores. When the first rays of the bright young Vogel sun had shone across them that morning, it was as if the forces of evolution had simply given up on them then and there, and had turned aside in disgust and written them off as an ugly, unfortunate mistake. They never evolved again. They should never have survived. And here they are, the sort of triumph of non-evolution, revolting, dreadful, and they go around destroying the beauties on their planet, the wonderful sort of beautiful sort of plants and animals they sit on and destroy or pull their sort of tentacles off in appalling ways. And I sort of love and loathe the Vogons in equal measure, but they seem to sort of speak to, I think, the other great thing about sort of Douglas, Neil, which was his, at the time, not yet sort of fashionable, sort of concerns about the environment and the loss of habitat and loss of species, which he wrote so beautifully about.
Douglas was way ahead of his time on setting off alarms, both in Hitchhikers and as soon as he could, to travel and go out. His book, Last Chance to See, I remember reading that and wondering if I would ever get to see any of the beasts and birds that he talked about in that book. And actually, a couple of months ago, I was on a ferry, and a nice lady at the next seat on the ferry said, would your little boy like to see a kakapo? And because of Douglas, I knew that a kakapo is incredibly rare, incredibly stupid, flightless New Zealand parrot. And so I said yes. And this particular kakapo had had some lead poisoning and was being taken to Auckland Zoo to recover, and had been handed over from whichever distant island the kakapos were on to somebody on another island, who then handed it over to somebody. And this lady was now the final link in the chain of kakapo transportation. And we got to look in to the little pet carrier and see a little flightless parrot. And I thought, there is a little link to Douglas even at this moment. But yes, he was absolutely incredibly aware of that stuff. He was one reason why Save the Rhino was Douglas's big personal charity. And this is a man who went up the side of Mount Kilimanjaro in a rhino suit.
Which is a wonderful Adams thing to do. I mean, I love that. I think there's also, speaking of Auckland Zoo, you've reminded me of my visit to Auckland a couple of years ago, where I flew to the Auckland Writers' Festival the wrong way round. I actually sort of went via Australia, via Los Angeles to Australia, and then on to Auckland to the Writers' Festival, having also done the festival in Perth. So I was in 5 time zones in one sort of moment and arrived disorientated in Auckland on the day I will always think of as the day of 5 breakfasts. It was always breakfast. It never seemed to move on. And a friend at Auckland Zoo invited me to go and see Auckland Zoo, and I was deeply, deeply sort of jet lagged and didn't really know where I was. But anyway, I wandered around and drew animals, and they allowed me in the enclosures and to sort of see things. And it was wonderful. And I remember a magical moment where I actually went into the monkey spider enclosure. It was rather sort of beautiful there, all the little spider monkeys sort of jumping around and being interested in my sketchbook. And then this sort of gentle rain started to fall. And I said, oh, it's raining. And the keeper said, no, the spider monkeys are peeing on you. I went all the way to Auckland Zoo to be peed on by the spider monkeys. It felt, again, like a very sort of Douglas Adams moment, possibly, the sort of great beauty and then absurdity at the same time.
He was definitely somebody who could always find the absurd and more to the point, the human in, because I think one thing that Douglas realized was the more human you make your moment, the more absurd it's going to be, especially if you're contrasting it with things big, things impressive, huge ideas, the vastness of the universe, aliens, the world, high technology, and Arthur Dent trying to persuade the ship he's on to make him a cup of tea, and thus
here is
practically dooming them.
Here's the cup of tea, very, very useful for sort of the type of travel that they go into. And here is my copy of that I brought along to show us. And just before we started, a friend of mine spilt a cup of tea on my book. So this is a pre-stained, very rare edition with actual tea stains on it. And they allowed me some end papers, which I'm very sort of pleased with. I've got two sort of, I managed to do some sort of end papers here. These are the flaps, which I like to think of as a sort of maybe a party in Islington that Trillian would have gone to. I imagine also the sort of party that you, Neil, would be very familiar with, chatting up girls at parties, as you know, characters are wont to do. And I had a very enjoyable time going through the text, finding every reference to aliens, sort of life forms that Douglas has sort of put into this book. And I found about 28. So here are 28 different sort of alien life forms represented on the end papers, with a little sort of legend here. So you can look up Rusty, the Mandrite miner from the belts of Orion Beta, Mandrill from the marshes of Phalia, Binky from the planning department of Alpha Centauri. They're all referenced in the book. It was a little bit of research I thoroughly enjoyed. And Neil, I absolutely agree with what you were saying about the sort of way in which you know, that there's a sort of wonderful sort of profundity with the humor in this book. And the very beginning is just, I think, sort of sums up, I think, exactly sort of what Douglas does so incredibly well. Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 92 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose 8 descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. This planet has, or rather had, a problem, which is this. Most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much all the time. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movements of small green pieces of paper, which is odd because on the whole, it wasn't the small green pieces of paper that were unhappy. And so the problem remained. Lots of people were mean and most of them were miserable, even the ones with digital watches. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they'd all made a big mistake in coming down from the trees in the first place. And some said that even the trees had been a bad move and that no one should ever have left the oceans. And then one Thursday, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, a girl sitting on her own in a small cafe in Rickmansworth suddenly realized what it was that had been going wrong all this time. And she finally knew how the world could be made a good and happy place. This time it was right, it would work, and no one would have to get nailed to anything. Sadly, however, before she could get to a phone to tell anyone about it, a terrible, stupid catastrophe occurred, and the idea was lost forever. This is not her story, but it is the story of that terrible, stupid catastrophe and some of its consequences. I mean, isn't that beautiful? Isn't that a sort of beautiful introduction, both profound and funny and true, in the pages of this wonderful, wonderful book?
Undoubtedly, and I think that is a marvelous place to close out on. Chris, thanks so much for sharing all that detail from the book, and thanks both of you for taking us through surely the best episode of Galactic Play School ever. That was a tremendously enjoyable hour, and thank you so much for joining us. This has been Forbidden Planet TV, and you have been watching the mighty Neil Gaiman and the supremely hypnotically talented Chris Riddell. Thanks so much for joining us. The illustrated version of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, illustrated by Chris, with foreword by Neil, can be bought from the links attached to this conversation. Thanks so much for joining us today, guys.
It won't be tea stained, is all I can say. But apart from that,
but you can make your own tea stains.
You can.
Thanks so much for joining us, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.